Welcome back to Supreme Myths. I am very excited today to have the person who I think is the leading election law scholar in the United States on Supreme Myths, along with a lot of other things he does. He is Rick Hasen, the Chancellor Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California at Irvine. He runs the election law blog. He has written numerous books, too many articles and essays to talk about. But his most recent book, Election Meltdown, Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threats to American Democracy, which came out earlier this year, is really important. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, as well as a brand new New York Times op-ed. Rick, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
It's great to be with you.
So how's your year been? Just kidding. Rick's a very busy man. Rick, your book talks about 4 different concerns about elections. And I think a lot of people really want to hear what you have to say about this. So if I have this right, you talked about voter suppression, electoral incompetence, dirty tricks, rigged elections. Can we go through each one of those and talk about where we are, where we're going, and what we should do?
Yeah, let me just say that the book came out in February 2020.
Yeah.
Before we went through the most recent election crisis.
Yeah.
And if anything, my book, which was called Alarmist, was seen as kind of understated in retrospect, given what we actually went through.
And in fairness to you, that's because we hadn't gone through Trump's disastrous post-election lies, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, we are really in terrible shape when it comes to the integrity of our elections.
Okay.
So the book talks about the book is about voter confidence and why it is that voter confidence is plummeting. And I point to 4 factors. One, voter suppression in a number of states, although not all states that Republicans control. Laws have been passed to make it harder for people to register and to vote. This attempt to do this convinces the Republican base that elections are being rigged and that steps are needed to be taken to prevent fraud. And at the same time, it convinces Democrats that Republicans are messing with the rules in order to suppress the vote, because there is no good evidence that widespread fraud is a major problem. And so you get this kind of feedback loop and this really unproductive debate about how much voter fraud there is. And, you know, the political scientists and others have been studying this for a few decades. The amount of fraud is quite low, and yet these laws keep coming. And of course, since the 2020 election and Trump's big lie, these laws are now coming in a much more dramatic way and a much more dangerous way, as we can talk about.
Yeah.
Then the second factor is election administrator incompetence. I tell a lot of stories in the book about how election administrators, because we run our elections in a hyper decentralized way, we have over 10,000 different election jurisdictions running a national election. You're only as strong as your weakest link. If there's a close election, people are going to focus on those places where there are those problems. I think fortunately in 2020, we managed to, thanks to Herculean efforts of election administrators, volunteers, $500 million in private money, shoring up our election system because Congress didn't come up with it. We managed to hold a very safe and secure election in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a presidential candidate consistently casting aspersions on the integrity of the process.
Rick, can I stop you there? Can I stop you there for 1 minute? So, I'm in Georgia, of course. And were you surprised how well the election officials, the Republican election officials here, stood up to Trump's bullying on these issues?
Right. So, well, my concern about incompetence is not about courage. Georgia has seen its share of election incompetence, and I talk about how poorly its voter registration database was run in 2016 and 2018.
Right.
Georgia still has a lot of problems with how they run their elections, but they did a pretty good job in the 2020 election. But what you're asking me about is a somewhat different question, which is about the courage that it took for Republicans like Brad Raffensperger and Brian Kemp. Kemp, who I criticize a lot in the book for things he did that were terrible for the confidence in elections. But I think they were real heroes in this election, as were the Federal Society judges who stood up to Trump when he tried to get the courts to overturn the results of the election. Right. There are a lot of heroes on the right that I think it's very important for progressives like us to recognize, because really that's what kept the rule of law going.
And just while we're on Georgia for 1 second, so I know that you talk about this in the article you just wrote for the New York Times, the op-ed, or I guess they're calling it, starting today, some guest pieces or something. I don't know. They changed
guest essay.
Guest essay, yes. But let's go back to Georgia for 1 second here, Rick. So, a lot of changes have been made to Georgia's voting law that have gotten a lot of publicity, especially the one about food and drink. But there's a change that happened that I couldn't get. I was interviewed by various local channels and DC channels. They wouldn't talk about this. The substitution of the Secretary of State as the head of the election board in Georgia. Can you talk about that for a little bit? Because that's really important.
Sure. So, and this is really taking us into the topic of my op-ed.
Yeah.
So I can turn there, and then we can come back to the other problems with elections.
Yeah.
But the we all understand what voter suppression looks like now. So, if you look at coverage of Georgia's new election law, so much is focused on things like, what do you can't give water to voters who are waiting online to vote for 3 hours or something like that, which is ridiculous. Only election officials can provide self-service water. I mean, just kind of like what a ridiculous kind of petty thing. But we can all understand, that's an attempt to, discourage people from voting who are waiting in a long line, which is already discouraging from voting. But I think what we're seeing in this election, post-election season, is something even more dangerous than voter suppression. But it's something that's very hard for people to wrap their heads around. And that's what I'm calling election subversion, which is the idea that not just in Georgia, but in a number of states, there are attempts to try to make it easier to actually mess with the counting of votes. That is so dangerous, right? So, we didn't really worry before this past election that election officials were going to cook the books. They were going to declare the loser the winner or anything like that. You may remember that Trump was caught on a recording with the Secretary of State of Georgia, Raffensperger, saying, all I need for you to do is to find 11,780 votes, the difference between his loss to Joe Biden in the state, which would, flip the state. Raffensperger stood up to him. Election officials in Arizona stood up to him. State legislatures in Michigan and Pennsylvania did not meet officially and try to declare alternative slates of electors. All the kinds of things that would have messed with the Electoral College. Although you had objections in Congress when the Electoral College votes were counted on January 6th after the insurrection, and 147 Republican senators and members of Congress voted to object to either Arizona or Pennsylvania or both of those counting. Nobody who was in a position of authority actually overturned the people's will. But now procedures are being put in place that are going to make it easier to do that. So in Georgia, in that same law that says no water, that says, we're changing the period for the runoff elections, things like that. It also takes Raffensperger out of the process of being on the election board, replaces him with someone handpicked by the state legislature, which is the most partisan body in Georgia
by far,
and allows the board to take over the process of running elections in up to 4 counties at a time, which it could include the big Democratic counties like Fulton County, where you are.
Yeah.
And that leads to a potential for messing with the election rules. And I say the potential because we don't know how things are going to go. But by the time we would know, it would be too late, So the next Trumpian candidate comes along, pressures election officials to change the rules, it could actually happen. And it's not just in Georgia. We're seeing in Texas, they're considering rules that would give poll challengers the ability to basically go anywhere and mess with the process of counting votes. We also saw not just Raffensperger and Kemp, but also the Secretary of State of Nevada, different election officials being censured for standing up for the rule of law, kind of sending the message, if you want a future in the Republican Party, you have to be willing at the very least to lie about election fraud, if not actually change election results. You put all this together, and I go through a number of other things that are going on, including the pressuring of nonpartisan local election administrators to quit, because they're facing threats of violence and intimidation and inadequate budgets.
So,
you put all that together, it's really a very toxic mix that could lead to an attempt to try to literally change the election results and declare the loser the winner in 2024.
So, okay, that's all really scary, and now I'm going to go soak my head in some water. But let me ask a historical question and a structural question. And I know more about the structural than the historical, but let's start with the historical. So I was always I've never researched this, but I've always been told that John F. Kennedy won the 1960 election because Mayor Daley in Chicago controlled everything. And I don't know what he did exactly, dirty tricks wise, or stuffing ballot boxes or whatever. But we've heard about Lyndon Johnson's antics in Texas. And is this new technology taking old tricks to a new level, or is this really a different in kind in terms of how election officials think about their election? Is that a fair question? Because I really don't know the answer.
Sure. So I think that there certainly are documented cases of elections being thrown, often by election officials. The famous one, as you mentioned, is Lyndon Johnson's Senate race, where
Right.
the votes came in late from Alice, Texas, and everybody voted in alphabetical order in the same handwriting. I mean, it was pretty blatant. But what's happened since the 1960s is that our elections became much cleaner. As you know, people are concerned about voting machines, and there are reasons to be concerned about them. But one of the reasons the voting machines were actually an improvement was that it was harder to mess with things when there were actual machines that were counting, as opposed to hand counting of ballots, where you could mess with the totals. So I would say since the 1960s, certainly 1970s, elections in the United States have been very clean. Now, that's not true at every election, especially on the local level. We have had instances of election administrators messing with election counts. But talking about statewide elections, we really don't see those kinds of things like we saw in the earlier periods. So I think the answer is today, we have a lot of safeguards. We need more safeguards. So one of the things I call for in the article is that every state should use voting machines that produce a paper ballot that can be counted. And Georgia now does that. There's some controversy over these machines and whether voters check the tabs and the fact that there's a QR code that's being scanned on the ballot. There are certainly things that could be improved, but there is a piece of paper. So there could be an independent body like a court that could double check election results. And that is a safeguard. It's not the only safeguard we need, but that's a safeguard. There are still a number of states, including Texas, that have counties that don't have voting machines that produce paper. They're purely electronic. And I think that is not only something where the election results can be cooked, but also it can foment conspiracy theories because there won't be a piece of paper.
Yeah, that seems crazy to me. I would think that should be a hard record of all votes. I certainly agree with you about that. On the doctrinal question, this is going to get a little bit thick, but we can deal with it, I think. So one hypothetical I give to my students in Con Law 2, after we talk about the redistricting cases and other cases like that, my reading of if we just look at the text of the Constitution, forget what judges have said. If we just look at the text, there is no right to vote in the Constitution. I can't find it. There's a right not to be denied the right to vote on account of race and gender, and then in the 14th Amendment. But I can't find a right to vote. That being the case, could Georgia, through the legislative process or a constitutional amendment process in the state, tomorrow say, you know what, we're now going to appoint our governors. We're going to appoint or the legislature is going to appoint the governor, or we're just going to name the president. What stops them from doing that? I know it sounds like a crazy question, but I don't think there is anything.
Well, so one thing is that changes that dilute minority voting rights might violate the Voting Rights Act.
In this court?
So I mean, you're asking me about the text.
Yeah.
So the Constitution gives in the 14th and 15th Amendment the power to Congress to enforce those amendments which prevent discrimination. So that's one thing. More abstractly, the Constitution says that Congress shall guarantee a Republican form of government for each of the states. And it seems to me if you don't allow people to elect the governor or the legislature, that you've now moved away from a Republican form of government. Now, long ago, the Supreme Court said that is not justiciable, but that doesn't mean that Congress can't act. And so, I think if it came down to that, you could see Congress acting. And of course, if that doesn't happen, then we're talking about the very kind of unraveling of our democracy that I'm worried about. That would have happened if the courts would have, for example, declared Trump the winner in Pennsylvania and in Arizona. That also would have been the undoing of our democracy. I mean, the stakes were incredibly high in 2020, and they will be in 2024 as well, because our system depends so much on norms. And even if you had a right to vote protected in the Constitution, people could ignore that. So yes, it would be better to have in writing. I had a piece earlier this summer in the New York Times this past summer called "Bring on the 28th Amendment," where I say that we do need a right to vote in the Constitution. Yeah. But if you're not going to have people enforcing it, you're not going to have people of good faith enforcing it. It's the right's not really worth anything. So really, the question is not just what is textually guaranteed, and I want to see greater textual guarantees, but what are the norms of democracy that are behind whatever is in the Constitution that will protect our society. And we have to focus more on those norms and on institutions for our democracy going forward.
It does kind of feel like we are reading your work, that we're hanging by a thread to some degree. And the increased polarization that's going on across all issues, whether it's affirmative action, guns, abortion, election law. Do you think that's played a role in this? I mean, is there some skepticism that we have two different countries now, and we got to find a way for elections to bridge that gap, but only if we have fair elections, right? I mean, it feels more polarized to me than any time in my life.
Well, so I think I want to make a very fine distinction here. I don't think it's polarization itself that is causing the problem. The United States has long been divided on issues like abortion and, maybe not as much on guns, but certainly on issues like abortion for a long time. But there used to be in the Democratic Party those who were anti-abortion, and there used to be pro-choice Republicans. And there are a few still, but for the most part, people have joined in bundles of issues. So where you stand, things are highly correlated. Where you stand on guns, or where you stand on abortion, or where you stand on immigration, those now are on the environment. Those tend to be correlated in a way they weren't before. So it's not just that we're divided on issues, we're divided into these two tribes and this kind of this tribalism. But the fact of the matter is that one of the two parties, it's the Trumpian wing of the Republican Party, has decided that the way to try to gain power is to attack all of the institutions that protect the rule of law and truth-telling functions. So that's the opposition party, the press, the judiciary, the FBI, and claiming that only they possess the truth. And so that it's asymmetrical. And I'm not saying that Democrats don't have their own problems with misinformation, disinformation. They surely do. But the Trumpian wing of the party is an attempt to harness a kind of racial and economic anxiety among white working class, often rural, but not only rural voters, and try and bring them along with those who are more traditionally part of a larger tent conservative Republican group. And this insurgency within the Republican Party, I think, is what is so dangerous right now. And that's why, when we think about things we need to do in order to promote democracy, the most important thing to do right now is to promote Republican moderates.
Right.
And there are ways to do that, for example, through primary reform, but it's Republicans that will stand up to Trump. I mean, I never thought of myself as a Liz Cheney fan before, but she's showing tremendous courage in the face of relentless pressure from Trumpians who will deny, for example, that the violent insurrection that led to the death of 5 people and the desecration of the Senate of the Congress. They deny what happened, and they deny that Trump was responsible for it, and that is incredibly dangerous.
I'm trying to figure out the motivations of Cruz, Harley, Cotton, I guess McConnell, although he's maybe a little different. These really powerful Republican senators who don't seem to want to take on Trump. What are they afraid of? Are they afraid of being primary? I mean, is Cruz really afraid of being primaried from the right in a Senate race in Texas? Is that what's motivating him? It seems odd. You know these people hate him, right? I mean, I think we can take judicial notice. I don't know about Cotton, but certainly Cruz and Hawley, they can't possibly like Trump. So what's going on there? It's so weird.
Well, I think that there are plenty of Republicans who are afraid of taking on Trump.
Yeah.
And who are worried about a primary.
Lindsey Graham.
Liz Cheney is going to face a primary. Everyone who has stood up to Trump, Raffensperger, Kemp, Trump is actively looking for people to run against them as a way of kind of flexing his muscle. I think that with Cruz and Hawley, the reason that they are hopping on the Trump train is because they want to be his heir apparent. They want to come in and they want to harness that energy. It's the same reason that Hawley and Marco Rubio are like, anti-corporation, we're representing the working class.
Right.
It doesn't ring true, especially you look at Cruz and Hawley and you look at their elitism and, product, Ivy League product and, all of that. I think it's a cynical attempt to try to hitch their wagon on and let Trump pull them along because, it's kind of which way the wind's blowing. Same thing with Nikki Haley, when Trump is down, she's criticizing Trump. When Trump is up, she's trying to, ingratiate herself with him. So I think that it's not just about fear. It's about looking, what's the direction of the Republican Party? And I think, it's always hard to see history changing when you're in the middle of it. I think we're in the middle of a potential historic realignment. And I wrote a piece back, there was a symposium, probably around 2010, in the Drake Law Review. I remember being in Iowa and talking about the Tea Party movement and talking about how there was ultimately going to be this schism between the kind of a highly educated Chamber of Commerce type, low taxes, socially liberal Republicans, and the Tea Party group, which even then, which said it was about the deficit. It was clear that it was this nativist, white, working class movement. And so, being funded by Freedom Works and the Koch brothers and all of that.
Right.
But so even then I saw that there would be this schism between the parties, and I didn't know if that meant that the Tea Party would become a third party. What it seems like is Trump is the heir of Sarah Palin's Tea Party, and it is the educated Chamber of Commerce wing of the Republican Party that's feeling increasingly uncomfortable, and some of them are going to be attracted to the Democratic Party. And so that realignment moment, you have to kind of choose sides. And I think McConnell is trying to preserve that Chamber of Commerce wing of the party and is certainly happy to have the Trumpian votes, but doesn't want to adopt a program of, fight trade, more handouts, the kind of Trump was quite conservative in a lot of ways, but not on the kind of financial issues that really motivate the McConnell wing of the party.
Right.
And so Hawley and Cruz, I think, they see the future of the party as being appeals to the white working class and, potentially Latinos, some of them coming along as we saw in the 2020 election. So I think that they're just being cynical political operatives. They're not operating out of fear, but they're operating because they think that that's going to be to their political benefit.
Switching gears just a little bit, because you said something that triggered something in me. I've been thinking a lot about Justice Powell recently, Lewis Powell, for a lot of reasons, and in a lot of ways he wrote some really bad decisions and voted in some really bad ways in Bowers versus Hardwick and his commercial speech cases. But I'm comparing him to Kavanaugh, Alito, and Thomas, or even Rehnquist, or even Scalia for that matter. It feels like in some regard, these three justices are so far to the right of anything we've seen before that it's kind of parallel to the Cruz, Trump, Hawley. They are so far to the right of the median Republican, and it feels to me like Kavanaugh and Alito and Thomas, certainly Alito and Thomas, are way to the right of the median conservative justice I've ever seen before. Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, I would certainly put Thomas and Alito in that category. In fact, Alito is someone who doesn't surprise you ever. Like Thomas can sometimes surprise you. It's like, students don't have any First Amendment rights, which, that's not something you think of a justice, or Thomas writes that, maybe we should regulate Twitter like it's a public utility and say that corporations are. I wasn't expecting that from Justice Thomas, right? But Alito is, more of a Tea Party justice than even Scalia was. Although I think Scalia was much more of a kind of person of the people, much more closely connected to the working class than Alito was. The kind of right wing populism. Yeah. Gorsuch, I think, takes his originalism and textualism very seriously. Whether he should or not, you and I have a different view than he does.
Right.
But the point of view that sometimes leads him to surprise. McGurk, there are decisions where he's not following.
So, Rick, hold on. When you say McGurk, you're referring to this big Native American case that's very complicated. But do you think that's about originalism and textualism, or do you think it's about Gorsuch fancying himself a Westerner and with common affinity, even though he grew up in D.C. and his mother was head of the EPA? He fancies himself a Westerner wearing a big hat in Colorado ranches, and his I think he's always been sympathetic to Native Americans. Do you think that's about text, or do you think it's about values?
Oh, I think it's about values, but he thinks it's about text. So I'm just saying I think he believes. He seems completely enamored of his as Scalia was of this jurisprudential approach, which he thinks is giving him neutral answers, which sometimes leads him to results that are not conservative, the way you would not get from Alito or Thomas. Kavanaugh seems to me to have very strong conservative instincts like Alito, but he's much more of a politician. And, he also has a reputation to try to rehabilitate. He wants to be brought back into polite society. So he's invited to give fancy lectures at law schools.
Right.
I think he fancies himself like that. So I think he's holding back somewhat. And Roberts is, I would call him the traditional Chamber of Commerce Republican, and that's why he's and Barrett, I think it's too soon to tell. Although I suspect that she's going to be much more. I think it's going to be Kavanaugh, Roberts, and Barrett as a middle conservative group. Certainly not like the way Kennedy was. I don't expect her to swing left, but I do think that she might moderate the more extreme forces, among Alito, Thomas, and in certain cases Gorsuch.
I hope
Gorsuch on voting rights is just abysmal.
Right.
And, I'm watching this Brnovich case very closely. Brnovich is a case involving this couple of Arizona rules for voting, where the Supreme Court for the first time is going to weigh in on how Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act applies outside the redistricting context. We know how it applies in redistricting. There's a case called Thornburg versus Jingles from the 1980s, and there have been a number of follow-on cases. So we have a very good sense of how that works, but we don't know how it works in the context of vote denial, these new voter suppression laws. And the Supreme Court has a tremendous amount of power now. And I listened to the oral argument. It was not clear to me where the court's going to go. And this is going to be one of the first big tests, probably before we get to abortion, before we get to guns. I mean, those are coming in the next few years. We're going to find out where they stand on voting rights. And it would not surprise me to see Kavanaugh, Roberts, and Barrett as a right-leaning but somewhat more moderate. I mean, the idea of talking about John Roberts as a moderate on voting rights and race,
I was going to say, what
just shows you how far things have gone. But someone like Justice Thomas basically believes that the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional and that it doesn't even apply to redistricting. He's got some really wacky views, and Gorsuch seemed to have gone along with him in some recent cases on that. So so you've got the far right, you've got the right, and then you've got the three liberals who have a much harder time finding 2 votes for what they want than when it was a 5-4 court. You can always find one more. So
one of the themes of this series has been talking to a lot of the leading law professors and political scientists around. Is I keep reminding people, and my agenda, that they're human beings, these justices. They're not gods sitting in a marble palace on a hill, and they have flaws and they have values. And I do wonder, there's a little teeny part of me that is a little bit optimistic, maybe. I may be going too far, about the idea that Roberts, for no law-related reason, but just a personal-related reason, might want to issue someday a voting rights decision that's not terrible to remove this, what he must now see as a huge stain on his legacy. That there's one, I'm kind of agreeing with what you just said, that maybe he'll be able to get one of the other conservatives to join the three liberals in a not terrible voting rights decision. Do you think that's possible?
I'm skeptical.
Yeah.
I don't think Roberts has changed his view. I don't think, someone asked Kennedy, it may have even been you, if he thought that Citizens United was wrongly decided. He was like, no, it was great. This is a few years after, like, you're saying what happened to you. No, this is what we want. I don't think if you ask Roberts if he thinks Shelby County was wrong, I think he'd say Shelby County was right. He might not like some of the kind of extreme stuff that's going on now with Trump, but I don't see him as a voting rights champion. And, Roberts' MO tends to be to move incrementally and to decide cases in ways that make it hard to see what he's doing. So to give you an example, there's a case called McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission. It's a campaign finance case from 2014. The case involved contribution limits. And one of the issues was what level of scrutiny you apply to contribution limits. The court has always said, quote, exacting scrutiny, which is this intermediate something between rational basis and strict scrutiny. And Roberts said, we don't have to decide here Mitch McConnell's argument that we should start applying strict scrutiny. And then he went on to redefine exacting scrutiny to make it much closer to strict scrutiny. That's a typical Roberts move. He said, well, we're not changing anything. And by the way, this is what it means. And he changed a lot. Yeah. So I could see that happening. There's another case. Rick,
1 second. So that McCutcheon case, I have to mention Posner once an episode because I just do. That's the case where he wrote in Slate, where you write, quite a bit, used to write quite a bit, where Roberts's view of the kind of corruption that can be the subject of campaigns finance reform was only quid pro quo and no other kind of corruption. Yes. And Posner wrote a piece saying he's either lying or he's stupid. And then he said he's not stupid, which I thought was interesting. Only Posner can get away with that. But I hate that case because writing a check, someone in Alabama writing a check to a politician in California, which is what that case was about, we can talk about money facilitating speech. I'm all over that. But writing that check is no more speech than writing a check to a plumber to fix, and the way the court, I'm sorry, I just hate that case a lot. It's just I think it's a terrible case.
Well, I'm worried because I listened to the oral argument this past week in the Americans for Prosperity versus Bonta case, which is not a campaign finance disclosure case, but it's going to affect those. And again, at issue is what does exacting scrutiny mean in the context of disclosure laws? And I'm worried the same thing's going to happen again. So you can imagine, back to your question about Roberts. Yeah. Roberts saying, I'm not going as far as Thomas and Alito and Gorsuch, because those three seem to be...
Because they're nuts.
Well, they seem to be ready to call lots of disclosure laws into question. But I could see Roberts saying something like, we're going to apply our familiar exacting scrutiny, which means, and then it becomes stricter. Right. And does he get Kavanaugh and Barrett or Barrett to come along, and then he's the controlling block? I could see that, Again, Kavanaugh doesn't want to see himself being painted as an extremist. I think he has a real personal, goes back to your point about these justices are people. Yeah. He has a very personal reason for being seen as not, not the terrible person that he's been painted by some on the left to be. He seems to care about that stuff a lot in a way that I think Gorsuch is like, you don't like me, you don't like me. I'm going to stand by my principles. I don't get that feeling from Justice Kavanaugh. Right. And again, with Justice Barrett, I think it's too early to know. But, my experience with the justices when they're new on the court is that they tend to be cautious. So there was a case before Citizens United called Wisconsin Right to Life, where Roberts and Alito issued this very narrow incremental decision that was the controlling decision. And that's where Justice Scalia wrote a concurrence agreeing that it was, agreeing with the bottom line, but not with how they got there, saying this faux judicial restraint is judicial obfuscation, if you remember that line, which basically meant, you're pretending you're not doing a lot, but you're doing a lot. And you need to come join us and actually say it. But Roberts has always been that way.
Scalia wrote that same opinion in the Hine taxpayer standing case about Alito's opinion in that case, which is judicial restraint is fine, but this isn't judicial restraint. This is just judicial craziness. I forget what he wrote. Rick, I have two more areas I want to get into. So the first one. So let's say you were appointed tomorrow election czar, which you should be. And you had some authority to make one or two major changes to American elections. I take it one would be a paper ballot for every state, no matter what. What other things would you do?
Well, back in 2012, I wrote a book called The Voting Wars. And what I called for then is national nonpartisan election administration. The way it's done in virtually every other advanced democracy in the world. You have a civil service body with someone who's protected, kind of like the Federal Reserve. And we can talk about how you get there to get somebody who's above politics, whose allegiance is to the fairness of the process, not to a political party. I mean, look, Alex Padilla, he's the new U.S. Senator from California. Before that, he was the Secretary of State of California, elected Democrat. And he's endorsing Joe Biden, and he's like campaigning for Joe Biden. Brad Raffensperger in your state of Georgia, it's like, I'm a Trump guy. It's like, the person running the election should not be making statements like this. And they have every incentive to, because most of them, not Raffensperger, but most of them have further political ambitions. Secretary of State is the stepping stone to the next spot. So
that's what Kemp was Secretary of State, if memory serves. Our governor was Secretary of State. Yeah.
Yes, and John Husted, who was the Secretary of State in Ohio, but is now the Lieutenant Governor.
Yeah.
I mean, so we need to change that system. And if, we have 250 years of local election administration, it's not going to happen overnight. But we need to change that. What I really want to see, I had a piece that made a lot of my progressive friends unhappy in the Washington Post about a month ago, saying H.R. 1 is not going to pass. H.R. 1 is this 800-page voting rights bill, campaign finance bill, ethics bill, does a million things. I love a lot of the things in it. I don't like everything, but I love a lot of things in it. But you're not going to get Joe Manchin blowing up the filibuster for this. But this is the moment. We don't know how much longer Democrats are going to retain control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency. This is the moment to put in some, number one, voting rights protections. So for example, every state has to meet at least a floor in terms of offering early voting and opportunities for voting. Number two, steps to prevent election subversion, like the paper ballot, right? And number three, bolstering Republican moderates so that we actually have two responsible political parties and we can crush the anti-truth faction within the Republican Party. And we need a vibrant and honest Republican Party to be the opposition party. And so what does that look like? Well, one provision of H.R. 1 says every state has to use redistricting commissions for congressional elections. You could try that. You could try a top four primary like they have in Alaska, ranked choice voting, right? There's all kinds of things that you could do to try to fix the way that we run our primary system so that Republican moderates have a better chance of being elected.
It's interesting. I love the idea of independent election commissions. Progressives were all mad at me, still are, I think, because I think the court was right not to hear the Rucho case. I think the court shouldn't get involved in all that because I want independent election commissions, which of course the court might strike down if it ever happens. But leaving all that aside, it feels like we've got to figure out a way to get a moderate Republican Party back that believes that democracy is at least as important as party, if not more important. And I don't know how Democrats can facilitate that other than moving to the right. How do Democrats facilitate that? That's a hard task.
It is, and a lot of it's going to have to come from the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And it's hard because this is not the time for this other discussion, but there are structural portions of the Constitution that right now work to the systematic benefit of the Republican Party. The composition of the United States Senate, 2 senators from every state.
Right.
We're going to be at a point in 20 years or something where, what is the figure? 70% of the population is going to be represented by 30% of the Senate.
Yes,
I can't remember the exact number.
Yeah.
We've got the Electoral College, so Democrats have to win by more, right? So I remember when Biden was ahead in the polls, they said, well, he could lose by 6% and Trump could lose by 6% and still win the Electoral College. And look, shift 40,000 votes and we'd be talking about the second Trump term right now. So
It's a terrifying thought, Rick.
they're just, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
But, there are things that can be done, like in states that have the initiative process, until the Supreme Court tells us otherwise, in states that have initiative process, like Michigan,
Yep.
you can have redistricting commissions.
Yep.
Arizona, redistricting commission. This can help. Now, that's not going to help in every state, but, agitating for, look, the fact that the business community in Georgia lined up against the voting bill, that was a big deal. And in fact, the voting bill, I don't think it's nearly as bad as it's been portrayed. I'm not a fan of it.
Sure.
And I told you, I'm really worried about the election subversion.
Yeah.
But you can imagine stuff that's much worse. And you don't even have to imagine it. Texas and Florida are about to pass stuff that's worse.
Yeah.
So pressure from the business community can help. Like those moderate Republicans, they don't want to join the Democratic Party. They want a vibrant Republican Party too. So Ted Cruz comes out and says, I'm not going to take corporate PAC money. That money's not really that big a deal, but corporate executives acting as bundlers and being big campaign contributors, if that goes away for the Republican Party, and they have to appeal to small donors, that's how, Trump was like Obama, was like McCain, like the populist candidates who can get a lot of small donors. That's a model that can work. It's the fact that, unfortunately for Cruz and Hawley, is that they're so personally odious. It's hard to see that they're going.
That's going to be the headline, Rick. Rick calls Hawley and Trump odious. I'm kidding, but yeah, I agree with you. So I want to shift. We have like 5 or 10 minutes left, and I want to shift total gears here. And thanks. You, by the way, you get the award for one of the most intelligent and most depressing podcasts of the of my podcast career. But of course, this is an incredibly depressing topic. I want to talk about Scalia for a minute. You wrote a book on it. I reviewed it. It was a great book. And there've been a couple books since. I want you to disabuse me of this, or maybe you won't. But as someone who wrote a book on Scalia, you're a good person to ask. I feel like his myth, that the myth of Scalia, is this overhanging shadow. So a friend of mine at Duke, Steve Sachs, who's really a nice guy and a terrific law professor. I don't like his originalism work, but he just got the Antonin Scalia chair at Harvard. And I'm glad for Steve. He's going to Harvard. He's a nice guy. I find it odious there's an Antonin Scalia chair at Harvard. Because just Scalia's last 15 years on the bench, he was on the wrong side of every civil rights issue ever, I think, with the exception of a couple criminal procedure cases. And his career, and he made odious comparisons between homosexuality and murder and all these other things, yet he is still a hero to the right, to the Fellow Society, to young students, to lawyers, to judges. And I find this to be almost, it makes me crazy. What is your reaction to all that?
So I think that Scalia will be even bigger in death than he was in life. I think I wrote that near the end of my book because, this podcast is Supreme Myths, right? And there was so much myth making around Scalia. He was the only principal judge. He set himself up as, Thomas is a nut, right? I'm the only one. I developed this in the introduction of the book, because the book was pretty much done when Trump went into office. I see a connection among Donald Trump, Antonin Scalia, and Newt Gingrich. I see
that's so sad. You're killing me here. Go ahead.
I see them as faux populist, right-wing disruptors.
Yeah.
Scalia came in and he blew up the Supreme Court. When Elena Kagan says we're all textualists now, it shows you how far the kind of
but it's all rhetoric.
Hero worship. What's that?
It's all rhetoric. I mean, what she means
by
rhetoric,
that. But we're talking about myths. So he set himself up as this, the one true. I alone can save you. That is Gingrich. That is Trump, and that is Scalia. And I really think that the three of them together changed the Congress, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. Scalia also was a celebrity justice, and I've written a lot about this, about how he would go and he'd do these appearances, kind of a rock star. He set stage for Justice Ginsburg to play that same role on the left. I think
Yep.
it's very dangerous when we have our justice. And I got a lot of criticism for going after Justice Ginsburg for all of this
Me too.
hero worship.
Me too.
I think it's really bad for our judges to be. In other countries, judges are more like civil servants. They're not,
Right.
jurisprudential rock stars. So it does not surprise me that some rich donor, would have a Scalia chair at Harvard, just like the George Mason Law School is the Antonin Scalia Law School,
Yeah.
not School of Law, because we know what that stands for, right? But it is not really about Scalia's jurisprudence. It's not really even about Scalia as the reality. It's Scalia the myth, which is So it's the same. It's like Ronald Reagan, right? Every Republican, at least until Trump, was saying, I'm the heir of Ronald Reagan. We're going to do this in Reagan's way, and then they do whatever they want. But I think that he set himself up, changed the institution in many ways, not for the better, and his legacy is one that allows for lots of conservative judging to be in the guise of applying neutral principles. And a lot of people actually drink that Kool-Aid.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Susanna Sherry wrote a great long article about celebrity justices and how dangerous that whole idea is and how it gets in the way. I love Susanna, and she's great to me in my career. I think her reliance on reason to decide hard con law cases is a little bit fuzzy, but I think she's right about this. I also think first of all, I think it's a great thesis about Gingrich, Scalia, and Trump. That's a great thesis. And there's a lot of similarities, personal similarities in those three men that I think would be interesting to pursue. I think that's really interesting, Rick, and smart. But the other thing about Scalia is, Harvard Law has two conservative con law professors, maybe Goldsmith and Sack, maybe three, whatever. But
their dean is John Manning,
right, and John Manning. But it wasn't that long ago Scalia called voting rights a racial entitlement. It wasn't a racial entitlement. It wasn't that long ago that he said, well, communities can prohibit murder so they can prohibit homosexual conduct. It wasn't that long ago he said that women aren't protected by the 14th Amendment in any serious way. Yet, we're giving out chairs, naming schools. Is it all branding? Is this he was just the best brander ever? How do we explain it? That's my last question. How do we explain it?
I think that there are many supporters of Scalia who wouldn't necessarily agree with all of his ideas.
Yeah.
Just like Justice Brennan, when Justice Brennan set up, allowed his former clerks to set up the Brennan Center, he said, don't make it about my ideas. You should go with,
right,
whatever you think is right at the time. Justice Brennan, for example, was very skeptical about spending limits. Had a different view on campaign finance than what the Brennan Center take.
Yeah.
I think Scalia's kind of set off a trajectory. It's more of Scalia as a mood than it is Scalia as on the particular issues. And so let's take Obergefell. I think this is great progress. I think a lot of Scalia supporters would be on the other side.
I agree with that.
The gay rights issue.
Yep.
Society progresses, and Scalia and Thomas they didn't evolve, but yet a lot of their supporters have. And there are certain third rail issues like abortion where they're not going to evolve, but on lots of other issues, Scalia did not put in his opinion racial entitlement. That was in an oral argument in a case before Shelby County.
Yeah.
And but that's not the part of Scalia that lives on, and that's not the part that people focus on.
Well, thank you.
I should say that I should say one thing, which is that my comparison of Gingrich and Trump, I think Gingrich and Trump have shown themselves to be personally immoral in how they've lived their lives.
Yes.
I don't see that with Justice Scalia. I didn't write a biography of Justice Scalia, but for everything I could tell, he was someone who was, played by the rules and was a moral person and a patriot. I say that at the beginning of the book. I think he was a patriot. I think he was doing what he thought was best for the country. I don't think that about Gingrich or Trump, so that does distinguish them. But they were all three disruptors of the status quo.
It's interesting about Scalia. I agree with your general point there. I do think it's interesting that there are certainly hundreds of tales of him going to law schools and being very generous and being, he always gave his speech about the Constitution is dead, dead, dead. But he was always very, nice to be around and all that. But I've also heard stories where that's not true. I mean, there was an incident at Virginia where he apparently got really mad because a student had a car accident and got there late or something. And there are enough stories about his personal life that I'm not sure we know the whole story. He's not a philanderer like Gingrich and Trump, I don't think. But whether he's moral or not, I'd like to reserve judgment. You did give me a great idea for a blog post, Scalia as mood. I'm going to be working on that, and I'll credit you when that one comes out. Rick, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope we can do it again in person when COVID ends, and I'll get you back to Atlanta sometime, I hope.
It was a great pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Rick.